Hey, what's up? My name is John Bonjour. I'm a comic artist and film enthusiast. I've drawn some art and I'd like to enthuse about this week's Halloween Horror Club film, The Burning. So The Burning came out in 1981. It was directed by Tony Maylam, who has done some other projects, but this is probably his most famous. It's about a camp caretaker who is notably a shithead, who accidentally gets burned in a prank and comes back for revenge, and that's pretty much the plot. It's a slasher. What are you expecting? The plot is people go to camp, people get killed at camp. I do just want to get this out of the way. The one thing that sets it apart from most other slashers, and it's a thing that I didn't remember because I haven't seen this movie in years, is that it's extremely gross and not in the fun way. It's a very pervy, weird little film. And that makes me kind of sad. I'm not gonna lie. I did not realize how weird a choice this was. Once again, that is the theme for this year apparently, because I watched this movie. I have seen this before. I remembered a couple of things. I remembered the raft scene, which we'll definitely get into. I remembered Cropsy, the killer, as a whole. I remembered the way he looked. What I didn't remember is camp counselors being extremely weird and inappropriate with the campers, people looking on other people in the shower without them realizing, and then we're supposed to sort of root for that person later. The general forcing of a person on another person a couple of times, which obviously a bad thing to do and have in your movie, especially if that's literally not the point at all, if it has nothing to do with that. The problem is I kind of tied myself to this movie by suggesting it last week. I couldn't change that in the middle. That's the whole point of the horror club. I should vet these maybe a little earlier. That's a thought, something I could do, but I didn't, and here we are. I do think there are some good things, but I did want to get that out of the way. I don't like this movie very much. I like parts of it a lot. But the movie itself, I just can't get on board with. And the thing that makes it so much worse is a little name that pops up right at the beginning, a producer, creator. He apparently was really involved, famed, notable piece of shit, Harvey Weinstein. And it's not his direction, but it's certainly a Weinstein joint. You can feel it. You can feel it. And feel how you feel about the whole Me Too movement. I'm not going to get into it because you won't care about my political views, and I don't think I'm smart enough to have strong political views. But I will say one of the best things to come from the Me Too movement is Harvey Weinstein and Bob, was it Bob? Whatever their names are. Them getting just absolutely ass blasted by everyone across the board was a really positive thing. I'm glad that happened. But I am going to try to separate myself mostly from that, although I will say the first and most important thing that doesn't work about this movie is that it is extremely gross and weird, and there's some really, really weird moments that I think are just like, why have that in there? You could probably shave 5 minutes total off the runtime of this movie, and it would feel so much less predatory. And I'm fully aware that there's an argument to be made for, the time and place that it came out, but I would argue that doesn't make it okay or good, and I'm actually fine to say that should not be a thing that we let slide. I'm gonna put that aside for now because I do want to actually look at this as a film, and this is a slasher classic. I said that before, and I stand by it. There are parts of this that are 100% revolutionary for the slasher genre. Some other things that don't work about this movie: the acting is generally speaking bad, except you, George Costanza. George Costanza's in this movie, everybody. I didn't even look up his real name. George Costanza from Seinfeld is in this movie, and he is extremely horny, but for people his age. And you know what? That's our king. That's our horny king. George Costanza, our horny king. Also, the music is absolutely no good. Probably one of those things that there's somebody out there who listens to this on repeat and thinks it's absolutely tremendous. It's not good. There's a couple of moments that feel a little bit like The Thing musically, and that's nice. But that is mostly what doesn't work for this movie. Obviously, I'll give it a pass for being fairly low budget and shot in 1981, probably shot in 1980. It came out a year after Friday the 13th Part 1. So it really becomes what the slasher is supposed to be. I think this is a critical point in slasher filmmaking. I think this leans a little bit more snuffy, if that's a word. Where like Friday the 13th will lean more into the fun and campy elements of it. This definitely leans into the pushing boundaries. Cropsy kills a night worker of the night, within like the first 10-15 minutes of this movie. That is one thing that I think this movie does very well, putting you in the shoes of Cropsey, not just from a visual perspective, but from a mental perspective. You get to see the world literally and metaphorically through his eyes. And I think you see that he thinks he's the victim here. It's not true, because he's the worst man. We hear all the horrible things he's done, and he's not an okay guy as far as I'm concerned, beating up children and possibly doing some other pretty horrendous things. But this does set slashers on a very specific path. What you expect. The raft scene, that is my favorite scene in the movie, without question. It's like the Raft Massacre. It's very famous. There's a reason that it's famous. I think that it sets slashers in the direction of, okay, we can push boundaries in terms of the killing, and thankfully, most slashers didn't really pick up on we can push boundaries in terms of just being an absolute nasty man. It sets the precedent for how slashers operate, obviously to be refined by Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, kind of bouncing it back and forth, and then Halloween, I guess. Anyway, the point being, The Burning is a critical piece in solidifying what a slasher is. And for that, I think it does a good job. A lot of it is very good. The slasher elements of this are very good. You've got Tom Savini's makeup, which always just a joy to watch. You have the villain Cropsey, who is pretty freaky. Like, just the visual look of him is gross. They shoot him well. I think he's imposing and scary, but he doesn't feel impossible to kill. Like, I like that he just feels like a guy who's been burned. This movie ends on a note that maybe he's ascended into some supernatural presence. And weirdly, I actually would have been really interested to see a sequel to The Burning, mostly because I think most of the time, slasher sequels tend to shave off some of the rough edges of what came before. Friday the 13th being a perfect example of that, possibly too far, where you get Jason X and him in space and doing like campy, goofy shit. I think The Burning 2 would probably emphasize more the idea of Cropsey as this larger-than-life, supernatural, burned victim villain, and hopefully lean out of the more uncomfortable, disappointing elements of the film. One last thing that I think does work really well about this movie, the pacing is very solid. The first chunk of this movie is Cropsey's origin, which I think is really well done. It's handled very briskly, and you get right to the point. I appreciate that. Kills the first victim, and then we jump over to the summer camp, the one across the lake from the one that burned down, and it's just summer camp shenanigans for quite a significant portion of this movie, longer than I expected. And there's an argument to be made for maybe you cut that down a little bit. I think that wouldn't have been a bad thing, but I do enjoy the buildup of tension. There's moments where you think, okay, we're finally getting cooking. Cropsey's gonna do his killing, and he doesn't. He's there, sort of, but he doesn't like get into it. By the time you finally get to the actual murders, we get one kill, and then the next series of kills are the Raft Massacre, which I wonder if they knew how notable a moment that was. I think probably because they went really hard on that moment, but it really does kick off right there. And that's 40 or so minutes into this movie, which is a long time to wait. But I really enjoyed it. I think it's fun to kind of live in this world where people are doing fun camp pranks and hanging out with each other and building relationships, and you see the dynamics going on. Would I have preferred that the camp shenanigans be less horrible? Of course. And I think if you were to remake this movie, which would be really interesting, you could lean out of that and it would not be missed. I think just do fun camp shenanigans and have some horny teens. I'm fine. It's a slasher movie. You're gonna have horny teens. I have no problem with that. The thing to me is that maybe they should be horny for peers, for like people who are on their age level and also consenting. That's important to me. That'll bring us over to wife quotes. My wife did watch this movie with me. She was just as uncomfortable as I was, if not more so. And also she didn't like any of the characters, which is fun for me. Her one quote that she really wanted me to say is there's a bit right at the end where Dave, Tommy, whatever the guy, Tot, maybe, I don't know, whatever the last guy, the final boy, the bit where he's walking through the burned down camp and like walking through the remains of that camp. The geography of that scene is so horrible. She said that it would be hilarious if this version of the movie just kept cutting through different portions of him turning around corners, and you could just do that for like a half an hour and we probably wouldn't notice for a really long time. And she's very right. I thought that was very fun. Aside from that, I have 3 pieces of trivia as usual. 1, this was one of the first movies to hit the UK's Video Nasty list. If you don't know what that is, it's a very interesting thing where the UK all got together and they decided, hey, these horror movies, these slasher movies, they're not good, they're bad for us, they're scary, they're evil, they shouldn't be watched by anyone. So they put a bunch of these movies on a video nasty list. The thought was, these movies are bad for society and will turn people violent, which obviously, retrospect, it's kind of funny. The assumption is that it was put on this list because of that Raft Massacre, which I would say is probably not the worst thing in this movie, but for the time, I see where they were coming from. I think a lot of those movies have gained a certain reverence just because of being on that list, and that's a very interesting thing to look into. If you read through that list, some of them, obviously, most people haven't seen. A lot of them, though, have probably gained more popularity because of being on that list, which is ironic, and I think that's fun. Review number 2, the concept for this film was based on an actual urban legend campfire story, which I just think that's pretty fun. It was originally called the Cropsey Maniac, something like that. I just think that's an interesting piece of trivia, something fun. Also, most of the wardrobe for this was just stuff that kids had, and I think that shows. I do think it lends a certain credibility to it, though. This is a pretty low budget movie, and I think it's interesting just that these are what kids would normally wear because it's what kids literally were wearing. That is kind of my thoughts on The Burning. I think a lot of it is really good and really solid. The majority of the movie is really entertaining and engaging and a solid slasher movie and an interesting camp teen movie. But man, it is hindered by just some of those moments that are really uncomfortable and unnecessary and just not fun to watch, and that's a shame. I think that this does have a place in slasher history. I just don't really particularly like it because of those moments. And now for your next movie, I'm gonna shake up the formula a little bit because I don't want to have another one of these videos where I'm just mad at the movie I chose. So we are gonna go with my favorite Halloween movie of all time, without question, Trick or Treat. Not the weird 80s one, the more recent one from like 2006. Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat. I don't think it's on this website, so I apologize for that, little ghost. But it is absolutely worth the money. It's worth your time. Go check out Trick or Treat, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for watching this video and checking out my channel. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on movies, comics, TV shows, Halloween, scary stuff, hit the like button, hit the subscribe, and comment down below what you'd like me to review next, or do none of that because I am not your dad.